I bought a Victorian estate in secret to escape my toxic family, but when I walked through the front door 3 days later, I found my mother giving a tour to my sister-in-law and a stranger. I did not scream, and I did not cry. I simply smiled, waited for them to leave, and then I changed every lock. They wanted a show, so I gave them a tragedy they would never forget. My name is Jordan, 34 years old, and I have spent my entire life being the bank account for a family that despises me. As a senior art appraiser, I know how to spot a fake from a mile away, but it took me decades to realize the biggest frauds were my own mother and brother. Before I tell you how I legally destroyed them without lifting a finger, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat who finally bit back. The gravel crunched under the tires of my Volvo as I pulled into the winding driveway of the estate I had closed on exactly 72 hours ago. It was a stunning 1890s Victorian home, nestled deep in the Connecticut woods, surrounded by the fiery oranges and reds of autumn leaves. This house was supposed to be my sanctuary, a fortress of solitude, where my mother Nancy and my brother Kyle could never find me. I had signed every document in silence and moved my savings with the precision of a ghost. But as the house came into view, my stomach dropped like a stone. Two vehicles were parked aggressively right in front of the wrap-around porch blocking the main entrance. The first was a rusted SUV that I recognized immediately. It belonged to my mother. The second was a gleaming silver Mercedes-Benz, likely a rental that belonged to my sister-in-law, Nia. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I had not told a single soul about this purchase. How did they find me? And more importantly, how did they get inside? I cut the engine and stepped out into the crisp air. The front door was wide open. I walked up the steps, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure rage against my ribs. I did not announce my presence. I slipped into the grand foyer like a shadow moving silently across the restored hardwood floors I had paid a fortune to refinish. That is when I heard it. The high-pitched, performative voice of Nia echoing from the formal living room. I peeked around the corner and froze. Nia was standing in the center of my living room holding a phone attached to a ring light stabilizer. She was wearing a sequined dress that looked ridiculous in the middle of the day. My mother was standing next to her, nodding approvingly at a stranger who looked like a contractor. Hello, my beautiful followers. Welcome to the official reveal of the new family headquarters. Nia chirped into her phone camera, panning the lens around my empty living room. Look at these high ceilings and the original molding. Kyle and I have been working so hard to secure this place for our future. This is going to be the birthplace of our new lifestyle brand. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. She was not just visiting, she was claiming it. My mother pointed a manicured finger at the antique fireplace. We need to knock that wall down immediately, she told the contractor, ignoring the historical preservation laws. It blocks the flow for Kyle's gaming setup. Just get the sledgehammer. They were literally planning to demolish my house before I had even unpacked a single box. The audacity was so breathtaking that for a moment I forgot to breathe. They truly believed that what was mine was theirs. But they had no idea that the woman standing in the hallway was no longer the pushover they used to know. I took a deep breath, smoothed down my blazer, and stepped into the frame. Jordan, Nancy exclaimed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, as if she were greeting a neighbor she secretly hated. You are early. We were not expecting you until the weekend. She did not even flinch. She stood there in my foyer treating me like a guest in my own home while wearing shoes on the antique rug I had just paid thousands to restore. Nia lowered her phone, but I noticed the red recording light was still blinking. She simply shifted the angle to capture my reaction, hoping for a public meltdown she could monetize later. I ignored Nia and stared straight at my mother, fighting the urge to scream. How did you get in here, Nancy? I have the only set of keys. The closing documents stated that all copies were turned over to me. Nancy let out a dismissive laugh and pulled a tarnished brass key from her oversized purse, dangling it in front of my face like a prize. Oh, please, Jordan, do not be so dramatic. Betty, the previous owner, is my bridge partner. She gave me the spare key days before the closing. She knows how forgetful you can be and agreed that family should always have access in case of emergencies. Besides, someone needed to come in and assess the potential of this place since you clearly lack the vision for interior design. My blood ran cold. She had conspired with the previous owner to violate my privacy before the ink on the deed was even dry. But before I could speak, Nancy's face hardened, shifting instantly from casual to accusatory. And frankly, I am hurt. Deeply hurt. You bought a 5-bedroom estate and did not tell your own mother. Do you know how embarrassing it was to hear it from Betty? You were going to hoard all this space for yourself while your brother is struggling in that cramped apartment. It is selfish, Jordan. Purely selfish. We raised you to care for family, not to abandon us the moment you come into a little money. I opened my mouth to tell her that I bought this house with my own earnings, from 15 years of grinding in the art world, not family money, but the deafening sound of a power drill shattered the air. The noise was coming from the formal living room. I spun around and what I saw made my heart stop. The contractor Nancy had brought in was standing in front of the hand-carved Italian marble fireplace. It was a 19th century masterpiece, the centerpiece of the home, and explicitly protected under the historical preservation addendum of the deed. He was holding a sledgehammer preparing to strike the delicate mantel. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Put that down immediately. Do not touch that wall." Nancy stepped between me and the contractor, blocking my path with her arms crossed. "Calm down," she snapped as if scolding a toddler. "We are just opening up the space. Kyle needs a flat wall for his 85-inch gaming television. That old fireplace is an eyesore anyway. It smells like soot and depressing history. Go ahead, Mike, smash it. We need this wall gone by lunch so Nia can film her intro video." I watched in horror as the contractor shrugged and lifted the heavy hammer high above his head, aiming directly for the intricate marble carvings that had survived 2 world wars but were about to be destroyed by my brother's need for a video game screen. This was not just an intrusion. This was a declaration of war. I lunged forward, placing my body directly between the contractor and the marble mantel. "If you swing that hammer, you will be facing a felony destruction of property charge before it hits the floor," I warned him. The contractor hesitated, looking back at my mother for confirmation, but the sheer intensity in my eyes made him lower the tool. He took a step back, clearly realizing this was not the happy family renovation project he had been promised. Nia sighed loudly, rolling her eyes as if I were a petulant child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. She walked over to me, her heels clicking sharply on the wood, and placed a patronizing hand on my shoulder. The camera was still in her other hand, presumably still recording this interaction for her archives. "Jordan, honey, listen to yourself because you are being hysterical," Nia said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We are not trying to hurt you. We are trying to help you maximize the utility of this space. Think about it logically. You are a single woman with no children and no husband. What exactly do you need 6 bedrooms for? It is wasteful. It is selfish." She gestured around the room as if she had already decorated it in her mind, dismissing my ownership with a wave of her hand. "Kyle and I are building a brand. We are launching a business that will support the entire family. We need the ground floor for the studio and the master suite for our image. It is only fair. Mom and I discussed it, and we think the attic apartment is perfect for you. It is quiet and out of the way, so you can focus on your little dusty antique papers without bothering us." I stared at her, unable to process the sheer magnitude of her entitlement. She was relegating me to the attic of my own $2 million estate. But before I could articulate the rage boiling in my throat, a loud thud from the hallway drew my attention. My brother Kyle came lumbering into the room, dragging a massive cardboard box labeled "Gaming Setup" across the pristine floor. The box was heavy, and I watched in horror as a staple from the bottom gouged a long white scratch into the dark walnut finish I had just restored. He was wearing sweatpants and a stained hoodie, completely oblivious to the tension in the room. He dropped the box right in the center of the formal sitting area and kicked it toward the wall. "Yo, Jordan, the cell reception out here is trash," Kyle complained, without even looking at me. "You need to get fiber optic internet installed by tomorrow. I cannot stream on Twitch with this lag. And tell this guy to hurry up with the wall. I need my triple monitor setup ready before the raid tonight." He began ripping the tape off the box, tossing the sticky trash onto the floor next to my feet. He was not asking for permission. He was not even asking for forgiveness. He was simply taking. In his mind, this house was already his. He had not contributed a dime, he had not signed a single paper, but because he was the golden child, he believed he owned the deed by birthright. "Get your trash off my floor, Kyle," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Our floor," Nia corrected me quickly, her smile vanishing into a cold glare. "Family helps family, Jordan. Do not be the villain in our success story. Just go upstairs and let us handle the renovations. You are ruining the vibe." I did not waste another breath on arguments. Logic does not work on parasites, and my family was the most aggressive species of parasite I had ever encountered. I simply reached into my purse and retrieved my phone. Nia laughed, thinking I was calling a friend to vent. "Go ahead, Jordan," she sneered, checking her reflection in the darkened window. "Call your little therapist. I am sure she will tell you to set boundaries while we set up the stream. Just make sure you are out of the frame, we need good lighting." I ignored her and dialed 3 digits. 911. "I have intruders in my home attempting to destroy the property," I said calmly into the receiver, my eyes locked on the contractor who was still holding the sledgehammer. "Yes, I am the sole owner. I am fearful for my safety. Please send officers immediately." The room went silent. The smug smile vanished from Nia's face. My mother Nancy dropped her jaw, looking at me as if I had just slapped her across the face. "You called the police on your own mother?" she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine shock. "You ungrateful little brat! After everything I sacrificed for you." 10 minutes later, the blue and red lights of a cruiser flashed through the bay windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent room. The moment the doorbell rang, my mother underwent a miraculous transformation. The arrogance vanished instantly, replaced by the trembling, frail posture of a confused, elderly woman. She threw herself onto the vintage velvet sofa, clutching her chest, and began to sob loudly. "Officer, thank God you are here," she wailed as 2 uniformed policemen stepped into the foyer. She pointed a shaking finger at me, playing the role of the victim with Oscar-winning precision. "My daughter has lost her mind. She is trying to throw her own family out on the street. We were just trying to help her fix up this old dump and she started screaming at us. Look at my poor daughter-in-law. She is pregnant and terrified." Nia immediately caught on, rubbing her flat stomach and widening her eyes to look innocent. "We just wanted to surprise her, officer. She has been so unstable lately since she got this money." The 2 officers looked between the crying old woman, the terrified-looking pregnant girl, and me standing stone-faced in the corner. One of them, a weary sergeant, sighed and adjusted his belt. "Ma'am," he said, looking at me, "if this is a family dispute regarding residency, this is a civil matter. We cannot remove family members if they claim to have a right to be here. You will need to file an eviction notice through the courts." Kyle smirked from behind his gaming monitors, crossing his arms in triumph. "See, Jordan, you cannot touch us. The police know who the real bad guy is." I did not flinch. I walked calmly over to the officer and handed him a thick blue folder I had brought with me. I was prepared. Inside was not just the deed but the nuclear option I had secured during the closing. "Officer, they do not live here," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I purchased this property 72 hours ago. Here is the title deed with my name and my name only. But more importantly, I want you to look at page 4, the historical preservation rider." The officer frowned, flipping to the page. His eyes widened as he read the clause. "This house is a registered historical landmark. Any unauthorized alteration to the structure, specifically the original masonry or woodwork, is a felony under state heritage laws." I pointed to the contractor who was still holding the sledgehammer near the fireplace. That man was hired by my mother to destroy a protected architectural feature. That is not a civil dispute about rent. That is attempted criminal destruction of state-protected property. If that hammer touches that marble, you are all accessories to a crime. Remove them now, or I will press charges against every single person in this room. The sergeant handed the deed back to me and turned slowly to face my mother. His expression had shifted from annoyance to professional sternness. Ma'am, you need to vacate the premises immediately. If you or your contractors damage a single brick of this property, you will be arrested for a felony offense. I suggest you take your family and leave before I decide to process you for trespassing right now. The contractor did not wait to be told twice. He looked at Nancy with pure venom in his eyes. You told me you owned this place, lady. You told me I had a permit. He spat on the floor near Kyle's expensive sneakers. Do not think you are not paying me for the trip out here. I am billing you for the full day plus a nuisance fee. He grabbed his sledgehammer and stormed out the front door, leaving a trail of drywall dust in his wake. Nia stood frozen in the center of the room. Her live stream had ended abruptly, likely cut off when the police threatened arrest, but the damage to her ego was already done. The friend she had brought along to help with lighting was already packing up her gear, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Nia looked at the empty room, then at me, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. She had planned a victory lap, but I had handed her a public execution. We are leaving, Nancy screeched, grabbing her purse. Come on, Kyle. Come on, Nia. We do not stay where we are not wanted. This house has bad energy anyway. I watched them shuffle out the door. It was a pathetic parade. Kyle had to drag his heavy box of gaming equipment back out to the car, struggling under the weight while muttering curses under his breath. Nancy marched past me with her nose in the air, refusing to look at me, as if ignoring my existence would somehow invalidate my ownership of the house. I followed them out onto the porch, standing at the top of the stairs, like the lady of the manor watching the peasants retreat. The officers stood by their cruiser, arms crossed, making sure the family actually left the property. Nia was the last one to get into the car. She paused at the door of her silver Mercedes. The humiliation had burned away her fake influencer persona, revealing the desperate, vicious creature underneath. She looked up at me standing on the porch of the home she had already claimed as her own, and her eyes narrowed. You think you won? Do you, Jordan? She shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. You think you are so smart with your little deeds and your police officers? But we know where you got the money. She pointed a long acrylic nail at me. That is Dad's money. You stole our inheritance. You hid it while he was dying, and now you are spending it on mansions while your brother starves. I did not respond. I just stared at her calmly. Start the car, Kyle, she screamed, slamming the door shut. But before the window rolled up, she leaned out one last time. Enjoy your house, Jordan, because by tomorrow morning, the whole world is going to know exactly what kind of thief you really are. I will make sure you never work in this town again. I watched as the two cars peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying everywhere. The silence that followed was heavy. I stood there alone in the autumn breeze, knowing that the battle for the house was over, but the war for my reputation had just begun. The first night in my new home should have been peaceful. I had won the battle for the physical space, but I had severely underestimated the war for the narrative. I woke up at 6 in the morning, not to the sound of birds chirping in the Connecticut woods, but to the violent buzzing of my phone against the nightstand. It was vibrating so intensely, it was about to fall off the edge. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and picked it up. My lock screen was a wall of notifications, hundreds of Instagram tags, Twitter mentions, missed calls from numbers I did not recognize. And right at the top was a link sent to me by a cousin I had not spoken to in 5 years, with a simple message that read, "How could you do this to your own mother?" My stomach turned. I opened the link. It led to Nia's TikTok account. The video had already amassed 2 million views in just 8 hours. The thumbnail was a zoomed-in blurry screenshot of my face contorted in anger with the word monster plastered across it in red capital letters. I pressed play and watched in horror as my life was edited into a horror movie. Nia had cut the footage with surgical precision. Gone was the contractor holding the sledgehammer. Gone was the part where they admitted to breaking in. Gone was my explanation about the historical preservation laws. Instead, the video started right at the moment I shouted, "Get out!" Then it cut to a shaky angle of my mother clutching her chest, looking frail and confused. Then it cut to Nia rubbing her belly, crying fake tears. The audio was overlaid with sad piano music. The caption was a work of fiction that would have made a tabloid journalist blush. It read, POV when your multi-millionaire sister-in-law kicks her pregnant brother and elderly mother out on the street in the middle of freezing weather because she needs 6 bedrooms for herself. I scrolled down to the comments. It was a digital lynch mob. One user wrote, "Who is this woman? Let us find where she works." Another wrote, "This is why we need to eat the rich. She does not deserve a house while her family is starving." Someone else had commented, "I hope the house burns down with her in it." I sat on the edge of my bed feeling the blood drain from my face. This was not just family drama anymore. This was a coordinated character assassination. Nia knew she could not win in a court of law, so she had taken the case to the court of public opinion, where facts did not matter, and emotion was the only currency. She had weaponized her pregnancy and my mother's age to paint me as a villain straight out of a Disney movie. I clicked on Nia's profile. She had posted a follow-up video an hour ago. She was sitting in what looked like a cheap motel room wrapped in a blanket, shivering exaggeratedly. "Guys, thank you so much for the support," she whispered into the camera, looking directly into the lens with wide, teary eyes. "We are safe for now. We had to use the last of our savings for this motel. I just do not understand how family can be so cruel. Jordan, if you are watching this, please just let us come home." I threw the phone onto the bed. It was a lie, a complete and total fabrication. But looking at the thousands of people rallying behind her, I realized that the truth was currently losing the race. The vibration against the mahogany nightstand was the only sound in the room, but this time it was not a notification from social media. It was the private line for the auction house. The caller ID read, "Senior Partner." My stomach dropped. My boss never called before 9 in the morning unless a multi-million-dollar painting had been stolen or the building was on fire. "Jordan, we have a problem." His voice was ice cold, devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for his top earner. "The Davenport estate just pulled their consignment, all of it. The Ming vases, the Impressionist collection, and the jewelry." I sat up straight, clutching the sheets. That consignment was the biggest deal of the quarter. I had spent 6 months cultivating that relationship. "Sir, that is impossible," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just spoke to Mrs. Davenport yesterday. We are scheduled for the catalog shoot on Friday." "Not anymore," he cut me off. "Mrs. Davenport saw a video this morning. Something about you throwing a pregnant woman into the snow. She is a philanthropist, Jordan. She sits on the board of 3 children's charities. She told me she cannot have her family legacy associated with someone who lacks basic human decency. She called you a liability." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Liability. In the world of high-end appraisals, reputation is the only currency that matters. You can be brilliant, you can be sharp, but if you are considered toxic, you are dead. I tried to explain. "Sir, that video is a fabrication. It is a family dispute that was edited to look—" "I do not care about the truth," Jordan, the senior partner, interrupted. "I care about the optics. And right now, the optics are that my star appraiser is being branded a monster by 2 million people on the internet. My inbox is flooded. We have 3 other clients asking to review their contracts. The board is invoking the morality clause in your partnership agreement." I felt the blood drain from my face. The morality clause was a career killer. It was designed to oust executives caught in major scandals like embezzlement or violent crimes, not family arguments. You are to report to the office immediately, he continued. The Ethics Committee is convening an emergency session at noon. Until you can prove these allegations are false without a shadow of a doubt, you are placed on unpaid administrative leave. Do not talk to the press. Do not talk to clients. Just get here. Click. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, realizing that Nia had not just embarrassed me. She had executed a surgical strike on my livelihood. I got dressed in a daze, putting on my armor of a tailored black suit. But when I walked into the auction house, the atmosphere was suffocating. The receptionist looked down at her desk, refusing to meet my eyes. Colleagues I had mentored, people whose careers I had helped build, suddenly found their shoes very interesting as I walked down the hallway. The silence was louder than any screaming match. I was radioactive. I walked into the conference room. 5 partners sat around the glass table. On the projection screen behind them, Nia's video was playing on a loop. My face twisted in anger. My mother crying. The caption calling me a monster. Sit down, Jordan, the head of ethics said without looking up from his file. We need to discuss the future of your license. If these allegations of elder abuse and harassment are substantiated, you will be stripped of your accreditation. You will never appraise a teacup, let alone a Rembrandt, ever again. I looked at the screen, watching the lie repeat itself over and over. I realized then that explaining was useless. They did not want explanations. They wanted the noise to stop. And I knew exactly how to stop it. I did not need a PR statement. I needed a forensic investigation. I sat in my car in the underground parking garage of the auction house, staring blankly at the concrete wall. My career was hanging by a thread, but the assault on my sanity was just beginning. The moment I turned my phone back on, it began to convulse in my hand like a living thing. It was not the public anymore. It was the flying monkeys, the extended family members, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had sat by for decades watching my mother abuse me were now suddenly very vocal. The first call was from Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. I made the mistake of answering, thinking maybe, just maybe, she wanted to hear my side of the story. I was wrong. Jordan, what is wrong with you? Carol screamed before I could even say hello. I just saw the video. Your mother is at the emergency room. Her blood pressure is through the roof. Do you want her to die of shame? Is that what you want? To kill your own mother over a pile of bricks? I tried to speak. Aunt Carol, please listen to me. Nia is lying. They broke into my house. Stop it, just stop it. Carol cut me off, her voice shrill and piercing. I do not care what they did. Kyle is your brother. He is flesh and blood. Yes, he is dopey, and he makes bad decisions sometimes, but you are the older sister. You are supposed to be the responsible one. You have this massive mansion all to yourself. Why are you so greedy? Why can you not just share? I hung up on her, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. Immediately it rang again. Uncle Frank. I let it go to voicemail. Then Cousin Mike. Then my grandmother on my father's side. The voicemails started piling up, transcribing themselves into a long, scrolling list of guilt and manipulation on my dashboard screen. I played one back on the car speaker. It was Uncle Frank's gruff voice filling the silence of the car. Jordan, you need to fix this today. You are making the whole family look like trash in front of the whole town. Go pick up your mother, apologize, and let them move into the guest wing. Nobody needs 5,000 square feet. You are acting like a cold-hearted stranger. If you do not make this right, do not bother showing up for Thanksgiving. We do not want you there. I listened to the chorus of accusations. Not a single person asked if I was okay. Not a single person asked if the allegations were true. They did not care about justice. They cared about compliance. They were angry because I had broken the script. I was the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is never supposed to have power or boundaries. They used the same old weapons they had used since I was a child. Guilt, obligation, the fear of being unloved. They thought that by threatening to exclude me from the family, they could force me back into submission. But as I sat there unemployed and isolated, I realized their ammunition had run out. I did not want to go to their Thanksgiving. I did not want their toxic approval. I looked at the phone one last time as another call from Aunt Carol came through. I did not answer. Instead, I pressed the power button and held it down until the screen went black. Silence returned to the car. They wanted me to share my house. Instead, I was going to close the door on them forever. I started the engine and drove out of the darkness. I had work to do. I thought the parking garage was the lowest point of my day, but I was wrong. I walked into the marble lobby of the auction house trying to make myself invisible. The security guard who usually greeted me with a smile kept his eyes glued to the floor. I pressed the button for the elevator, praying for the doors to open quickly so I could escape the heavy atmosphere of judgment. But just as the bell dinged, a familiar screech echoed across the cavernous hall. "Jordan. Jordan, please wait." I froze. My mother Nancy came rushing through the revolving doors. She looked disheveled. Her hair was uncombed, and she was wearing a coat that looked like she had slept in it. It was a costume. My mother never left the house without perfect makeup. This was a calculated look designed for maximum sympathy. Before I could step into the elevator, she threw herself onto the polished floor right in the center of the lobby. She landed on her knees with a loud thud, clasping her hands together in a prayer position. The sound drew the attention of everyone. Clients in expensive suits, receptionists, and the entire morning rush of employees stopped to watch. "Please, Jordan," she wailed loud enough for the acoustics of the lobby to amplify her voice. "Please forgive your brother. He made a mistake. He is just a boy. Do not let them take him away. You are the only one who can save this family." I stood there mortified. "Get up, Nancy," I hissed, keeping my voice low. "You are making a scene." She crawled forward, grabbing the hem of my pants. "I am begging you. He is in trouble, Jordan. Serious trouble. He borrowed money from bad people to pay for that studio equipment. They are going to hurt him if we do not pay by noon. I just need you to help us this one time. Just sign this, and I promise we will disappear." She pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket and shoved it into my hand. Tears were streaming down her face, but her eyes were dry and sharp, watching me closely. I looked at the document. It was not an apology letter. It was a co-signer application for a high-risk personal loan of $50,000 with an predatory interest rate. She was not here to apologize. She was here to use the public pressure of my workplace to force me into financial ruin. She knew I would do anything to make her stop screaming in front of my boss. I looked down at her. "You want me to co-sign a loan for Kyle?" I asked loudly so everyone could hear. "After he broke into my house? After you tried to destroy my career?" "No." Nancy's face contorted. The grieving mother mask slipped. "You selfish witch," she screamed, grabbing my leg tighter. "You have millions. You sit up in your ivory tower while your brother is being hunted. Sign the paper. Sign it, or I will scream until every client in this building knows you want your brother dead." "Security," I called out, stepping back and shaking her off my leg. "Remove this woman from the premises." Two guards rushed over, pulling Nancy to her feet. She began to kick and scream, flailing her limbs like a wild animal. "Help me. She is killing us. My daughter is a monster. Look at her, she is laughing at me." I was not laughing, I was trembling. As the guards dragged her out the revolving doors, the lobby fell into a deathly silence. I looked around. Dozens of phones were recording. My colleagues were whispering behind their hands. I saw the head of HR standing by the elevators, shaking her head in disapproval. I had protected my bank account, but my mother had successfully detonated a bomb in the middle of my professional sanctuary. I walked into the elevator alone, and as the doors closed, I knew that my suspension was about to become a termination. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel of my car, parked 3 blocks away from the office building I had just been escorted out of. I felt exposed and raw, like a layer of skin had been peeled back for the world to scrutinize. The humiliation of my mother kneeling in the lobby was burned into my retinas, but the universe was not done with me yet. My phone, which I had thrown onto the passenger seat, lit up with a single notification. It was not a call from HR. It was not a plea from my mother. It was a text message from Kyle. I picked up the device, my thumb hovering over the screen. I expected an apology, or perhaps a request for me to come pick up Mom. Instead, what I read made the blood freeze in my veins. The message was long, rambling, and filled with the kind of desperate malice that only a cornered animal possesses. It read, "Do not think you are untouchable just because you have money. I know what you did last year with the sale of the Victorian landscape painting. I know you took a cash payment under the table to lower the commission fees. I have the dates. I have the buyer's name. Transfer $50,000 to my account by 5 this afternoon, or I am calling the IRS fraud tip line. I will ruin you, Jordan. I will make sure you rot in prison for tax evasion." I stared at the words blinking on the screen. For a moment, the sheer audacity of it took my breath away. Then something unexpected happened. I started to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and built into a hysterical release of tension. Kyle, my lazy, uneducated brother, who had never filed a tax return in his life, thought he could blackmail me over the sale of the Harrison estate collection. The irony was delicious. In my line of work, financial transparency is not just a preference, it is a requirement. I have a team of forensic accountants who audit every single transaction I make, down to the price of a stapler. That landscape painting he was referring to was sold for $1.2 million, and I had paid exactly $340,000 in capital gains tax on it. I had the receipts. I had the bank transfer records. I had a letter from the IRS confirming the filing. I was cleaner than a surgical theater. But Kyle did not know that because in Kyle's world, everyone was a scammer. He projected his own lack of integrity onto everyone else. He assumed that because he would steal if given the chance, I must be stealing too. But beneath the laughter, a cold, hard realization settled in my gut. This text message changed everything. Up until this moment, Kyle had just been a nuisance, a spoiled brat who felt entitled to my success. But this was a felony. This was extortion. He was threatening to use federal agencies to destroy my life unless I paid him protection money. He had crossed the line from toxic family member to active criminal. I did not reply. I did not type out a furious defense telling him I was innocent. I did not block him. Instead, I took a screenshot of the text. Then I took another, ensuring the timestamp and his phone number were clearly visible. I opened a hidden folder on my phone labeled Evidence and saved the images. Kyle thought he was holding a gun to my head. He did not realize he had just handed me the bullets I would eventually use to shoot him down. He wanted $50,000. What he was going to get was a prison sentence. I put the car in drive and pulled out into traffic. I was done crying. It was time to start building my case. I drove straight to my apartment, which I still rented despite owning the new house. I needed to gather ammunition. The silence of my small living room felt like a sanctuary after the chaos of the morning. I went straight to the wall safe behind the painting in my office and spun the dial. The heavy steel door creaked open, revealing rows of neatly organized files. These were not just papers. They were the receipts of my servitude. I pulled out a thick red folder labeled Family Debts. I sat on the floor and opened it. The first document on top was a bank transfer receipt from 5 years ago. $55,000. That was the day I saved my father from bankruptcy. He had gambled away the mortgage payments on online poker. I remembered him crying at my kitchen table, begging me not to tell Mom, promising he would pay me back. He never did. I flipped the page. A cashier check for $30,000 made out to Sunrise Rehabilitation Center. That was for Kyle. 4 years ago, he had crashed his car while high on prescription pills. I paid for his treatment. I paid for his lawyer to keep him out of jail. I paid for the car he totaled. The paper trail went on and on. Medical bills for my mother's elective surgeries that insurance refused to cover. Bail money for Kyle's second DUI. A personal loan to cover the property tax on my parents' house so they would not be evicted. I ran my finger down the ledger I had kept. The total sum was staggering, over $300,000. I had drained my 401k. I had worked nights and weekends. I had sacrificed my own comfort for a decade to keep this family afloat. And not once did I ask for it back. I picked up the text message on my phone again, reading Kyle's threat. Transfer $50,000 or I call the IRS. He was demanding money from the very person who had kept him out of prison. The audacity was so sharp it almost felt physical, like a knife twisting in my gut. They did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me as a resource, an unlimited line of credit that had suddenly been declined. I took a deep breath and stood up. I was not going to send these receipts to Kyle. He would not care. He would just say I owed it to him because I was successful. Instead, I began to scan them one by one into my digital cloud. I was building a timeline. If they wanted to talk about money, we would talk about money, but we would do it on my terms. I organized the files into a new folder on my laptop. I named it Extortion Defense. Then I saw something else in the safe, a small velvet box. Inside was my grandmother's ring, the only thing she had left me, directly bypassing my mother. I put it on my finger. It was a reminder that not everyone in my bloodline was a leech. My grandmother had been a fighter. She had built the family fortune that my parents squandered, and she would have wanted me to fight for what was mine. I closed the safe with a loud metallic clank. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Kyle wanted a war over finances. He had no idea he was declaring war on his biggest creditor. I grabbed my car keys. It was time to meet the only person who could help me turn this evidence into a weapon, my private investigator. Most people would have set up a tripod and recorded a tearful apology video to beg for the internet's forgiveness. That is the standard playbook. You cry, you apologize for things you did not do, and you hope the mob moves on to the next victim. But I knew that engaging with a smear campaign is like wrestling a pig in the mud. You both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. If I posted a defense, they would just dissect my facial expressions and accuse me of gaslighting. So I chose silence. Let the internet think I was hiding. In reality, I was hunting. 2 hours after leaving the safe house, I walked into a nondescript office building in downtown Hartford. There was no sign on the frosted glass door, just a suite number. This was the office of a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud and high-stakes asset recovery. He was expensive, discreet, and terrifyingly efficient. He did not look like a detective from a movie. He looked like a bored accountant, wearing a gray sweater and reading glasses. He did not offer me coffee. He simply opened a blank notebook and looked at me. I need a deep dive on my sister-in-law, I said, sliding a manila envelope across the metal desk. Her name is Naya. She married my brother 6 months ago in a quick ceremony in Las Vegas. She claims to be a lifestyle influencer with family money from Atlanta, but I have never seen her parents. I have never seen a wire transfer from them, and she is desperate. Desperate enough to break into a house to fake a lifestyle she cannot afford. The investigator opened the envelope, glancing at the few photos I had managed to print out from her Instagram. He looked at the picture of Nia posing with a designer bag. "Is that a Birkin bag?" he asked, his voice monotone. "She claims it is," I replied. "It is a fake," he said without looking up. "The stitching on the handle is wrong. If she is faking her accessories, she is likely faking her assets. What is the objective of this investigation?" I leaned forward. "I want to know where the money comes from, or more accurately, where the debt is coming from. My brother is suddenly being chased by loan sharks. Nia is leasing luxury cars she cannot afford. Someone is funding this charade, or someone is being defrauded to keep it running. I want to know who she owes. I want to know if she has prior aliases, and I want to know if she has done this to another family before us." He typed something into his computer, his eyes scanning lines of code that reflected off his glasses. Influencers are usually the easiest to crack. They live their lives online, but they leave digital footprints in the shadows. If she has a past, I will find it. This will cost you a retainer of $5,000. I wrote the check without hesitating. It was a lot of money, especially since I was currently unemployed, but I considered it an investment in my survival. Find everything I said standing up: who she dated, where she lived, her credit score, her criminal record. If she jaywalked in 2015, I want to know about it. He nodded once and closed the notebook. I will have a preliminary report in 24 hours. Keep your head down. If she is a grifter and she feels cornered, she will escalate. I walked out of the office feeling a strange sense of calm. Nia thought she was winning because she had the likes and the views. She did not realize that while she was playing for an audience, I was playing for a verdict. She had built a castle out of lies, and I had just hired the man who was going to locate the loose brick that would bring the whole thing crashing down. 24 hours later, exactly as promised, a secure email notification popped up on my laptop screen. I was sitting in a corner booth of a quiet cafe far away from the prying eyes of my family and the whispers of my colleagues. I took a sip of black coffee and opened the attachment. The subject line read, "Comprehensive Background Check, Target, Nia Brooks." I started reading and my jaw nearly hit the table. I expected to find some debt or maybe a lie about her college degree. But what I found was a financial autopsy of a woman who was legally drowning. The woman who claimed to be an heiress from a wealthy Atlanta family was actually a college dropout from Florida, with a credit score of 420. She had 3 active evictions on her record in the last 5 years. Her bank accounts were not just empty, they were overdrawn by thousands of dollars across multiple institutions. The report detailed the reality of her luxury lifestyle. That silver Mercedes she drove was not a lease. It was a weekly rental from a predatory agency, and she was 2 weeks late on the payment. The repo men were actively looking for the vehicle. The designer clothes she wore in her videos were all from a high-end rental service, and she had been banned from the platform for returning items stained or damaged. And the Birkin bag. The investigator had zoomed in on high-resolution photos from her social media. The stitching was wrong. The hardware was the wrong shade of gold. It was a counterfeit likely purchased for $200 from a website based overseas. But the most damning piece of information was on page 10 under the section labeled Current Activities. Nia was not just broke. She was desperate. The investigator had found a digital paper trail linking her to a new domain name she had registered 2 weeks ago called the Prosperity Circle. It was formatted exactly like a classic Ponzi scheme. She was preparing to launch an exclusive investment course, claiming she could teach people how to become millionaires by following her business model. Suddenly, the desperation to break into my home made perfect sense. It was not just about finding a place to sleep. She needed a stage set. To sell a lie about wealth, you need to look wealthy. She needed my Victorian estate, my antique fireplace, and my manicured gardens to serve as the backdrop for her pitch videos. She was planning to use my property to defraud investors out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, claiming it was her own success story. She was not just a squatter. She was a con artist standing on the edge of a cliff, needing a golden parachute to save her from prison time for her previous debts. I closed the laptop, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction wash over me. Nia was terrified. She was running out of time and money, and she needed my house to pull off her final heist. She thought she was fighting a family feud, but she had no idea that I now held the blueprint to her destruction. I picked up my phone. It was time to set the trap. The investigation into Nia's fraudulent past was a long game, but I still had a job to do. I spent the next 3 days in New York City appraising a private collection for a client who had not seen the viral video yet. It was a welcome distraction. For 72 hours, I was just Jordan the professional, not Jordan the monster, who evicted her pregnant sister-in-law. But as I drove back to Connecticut, the knot in my stomach returned tightening with every mile marker that brought me closer to the war zone I used to call home. I pulled into my driveway at dusk. The house looked different. The lights were all on, blazing from every window like a lighthouse. I had left the house dark to save electricity. A sense of dread washed over me as I parked my car. I walked up the porch steps, my keys in hand, ready to retreat into the silence of my sanctuary. I slid my key into the deadbolt. It stopped halfway. The metal scraped against a blockage. I tried again, jiggling the handle, thinking perhaps the old mechanism was just stiff from the cold. But when I crouched down to inspect the keyhole, I saw the shiny glint of fresh brass. The lock was not old. It was brand new. My breath hitched. I tried the handle. Locked. I went to the side door. Locked. And there, too, the hardware had been replaced. I stepped back onto the lawn and looked through the large bay window of the living room. What I saw made my knees weak. My furniture, the antique pieces I had curated with such care, had been pushed against the walls. In the center of the room sat a massive, ugly sectional sofa that I had never seen before. And sitting on it was my family. My mother Nancy was wearing a silk robe, drinking wine out of one of my crystal goblets. Kyle was sprawled out with his feet up on my coffee table, playing a video game on the TV that was now mounted directly into the drywall above the fireplace. Nia was walking around in the background, holding swatches of fabric, clearly planning new curtains. They looked comfortable. They looked settled. They looked like they owned the place. I pounded on the front door, the heavy wood vibrating under my fist. "Open this door immediately!" I screamed, my professionalism cracking under the sheer weight of the violation. The living room went quiet. I saw Kyle pause his game. A moment later, the door opened, but only a few inches, stopped by a security chain. My mother's face appeared in the crack. She was not scared. She was smiling. "Oh, you are back," she said casually, sipping her wine. "We were wondering when you would show up. Please do not scratch the paint, Jordan. We just touched it up. You changed the locks," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You broke into my house while I was away and you changed the locks." "We did not break in," Nancy corrected me smugly. "We moved in. You left the property vacant for 3 days, Jordan. We were worried about security, so we took possession to protect the asset. Besides, family belongs together. We have already unpacked. Kyle has the master bedroom, and Nia is setting up the nursery in the guest wing." I stared at her, unable to comprehend the level of delusion. "You have 5 minutes to get out before I call the police." Nancy laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Go ahead and call them. We are not intruders anymore, Jordan. We have mail delivered here now. We have clothes in the closets. We are residents. And you are just a guest who is causing a disturbance on our front porch. Now, if you will excuse me, my show is on." She slammed the door in my face. I heard the deadbolt slide home with a heavy final click. I stood there on the dark porch of my own $2 million estate, realizing that they had just executed a hostile takeover. They had not just stolen my house. They had stolen my sense of safety. And this time, they knew exactly what they were doing. For the second time in a week, I stood on my own front porch, bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser. The neighbors were definitely watching now, curtains twitching in the windows across the street. This time I felt certain of the outcome. They had broken in. They had changed the locks. This was burglary, plain and simple. When the heavy oak door finally opened, it was not my mother. It was Kyle. He was leaning against the doorframe, picking his teeth with a casual arrogance that made my blood boil. He did not look like a man who was about to be arrested. He looked like a man holding a winning lottery ticket. "Officer, this woman is harassing us," Kyle said before the policeman could even speak. "She is my sister, and she is the landlord, but she is violating the 24-hour notice rule for inspections. We are trying to have a quiet family dinner." The officer, a burly man named Sergeant Miller, turned to me. "Ma'am, is this true? Are you the landlord?" "I am the owner." I snapped, thrusting the deed forward again. "They are intruders. They changed the locks without my permission. Arrest them." Kyle sighed theatrically, reaching into his back pocket. He pulled out a crisp, folded document and handed it to the officer. "Actually, officer, we have a valid lease agreement signed by Jordan herself just last week. We paid the first month and the security deposit in cash. She is just angry because we asked her to fix the boiler, and now she is trying to illegally evict us." The officer opened the document. I craned my neck to look. It was a standard residential lease agreement downloaded from the internet. At the bottom was a signature that looked vaguely like mine, but with a loop on the J that I never made. "That is a forgery." I shouted, my voice cracking. I never signed that. That is not my signature. This is insane. Sergeant Miller looked at the lease, then at the deed, then at me. He handed the paper back to Kyle. Ma'am, he said, his voice dropping into that tired, bureaucratic tone that nightmares are made of. This is a valid-looking legal document. If you claim the signature is forged, that is a matter for the courts to decide, not the police department. But they are squatters, I pleaded, pointing at the new lock. You cannot just let them steal my house because they printed a paper from the internet. Ma'am, the officer interrupted firmly, raising his hand. Once a lease is presented and they have established residency by moving in furniture and changing locks, this becomes a civil matter. I cannot determine the validity of a signature on a front porch at 8 p.m. Under state law, they are tenants. You cannot force them out. You cannot cut the power. You cannot change the locks back. If you want them gone, you have to file for a formal eviction in housing court. Kyle smirked, waving the fake lease like a flag of victory. Sorry about the confusion, officer. We just want to pay our rent and live in peace. I stood there frozen as the officer tipped his hat and walked back to his car. I knew exactly what this meant. In this state, housing courts were backlogged. An eviction hearing could take 6 months, maybe even a year. For the next year, my family could live in my house, destroy my property, and ruin my life legally. Kyle leaned close to me, his breath smelling of the expensive wine he had stolen from my cellar. Better call a lawyer, sis, he whispered. I hear the waiting list for court dates is pretty long this year. Oh, and do not come back without an appointment. That is trespassing. He slammed the door. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the night. I was standing on my own doormat, holding the keys to a house I could no longer enter, locked out by a piece of paper and a lie. The porch light clicked off, leaving me standing in the darkness. The message was clear. I was no longer welcome at the property I paid the mortgage on. I turned to walk down the steps, defeated and humiliated, when the living room curtains parted. Nia was standing there, her face illuminated by the glow of the television. She unlatched the window and slid it open just enough to speak through the screen. She was holding a slice of pizza, my pizza that she had likely ordered using the credit card I kept in the kitchen drawer. Hey, Jordan, she called out, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Do not be too sad. We will take good care of the place. Well, maybe not that good. She took a bite of the pizza, chewing slowly while staring me down. My cousin is a lawyer. He told us all about tenants' rights in Connecticut. Since we have established residency and have a lease, even a disputed one, you cannot just kick us out. You have to file for eviction. And do you know how backed up the courts are right now? She laughed, a cruel sound that cut through the night air. It will take at least a year to get a hearing. Maybe 18 months if we keep filing appeals. Do you know what this house will look like in 18 months? She gestured behind her to where Kyle was already shouting at his video game. We are going to live hard in this house, Jordan. The carpets will be stained, the walls will be scratched. That antique fireplace you love so much. Kyle is thinking about painting it neon green to match his gaming chair. By the time the sheriff finally comes to drag us out, this place will be nothing but a shell. So go ahead and sue us. We have nothing to lose, but you have everything to lose. She slammed the window shut and yanked the curtains closed. I stood there shaking, not from the cold, but from a level of rage I had never experienced before. They were holding my home hostage. They were going to systematically destroy my sanctuary just to punish me for being successful. I walked back to my car, my legs feeling heavy as lead. I keyed the ignition and took one last look at the house. I could see the flicker of the television through the fabric of the curtains. They were in there eating my food, sitting on my furniture, laughing at my expense. I drove to the nearest Marriott hotel 5 miles down the highway. The lobby was sterile and smelled of industrial cleaner, a sharp contrast to the lavender and old wood scent of my home. I handed the receptionist my credit card, my hand trembling slightly. One night the receptionist asked, "Make it a week," I replied, my voice hollow. I walked into the beige hotel room and threw my bag onto the bed. I did not turn on the lights. I sat by the window looking out at the parking lot. The anger that had been boiling inside me began to cool, hardening into something solid and sharp. Nia was right about one thing. The civil court system was broken. It protected squatters and punished owners. If I played by the rules of a landlord-tenant dispute, I would lose. My house would be destroyed long before a judge ever banged a gavel. But Nia had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed I would fight like a landlord. She assumed I would file papers and wait my turn. I stared at the blinking red light of the smoke detector on the ceiling. I was done being the victim. I was done being the polite daughter. They wanted to use the law as a shield. Fine. I would use it as a sword. They had turned this into a criminal enterprise, and tomorrow I was going to treat them like criminals. I was not going to hire a real estate attorney. I was going to hire a shark. The morning sun hit the glass facade of the Stark Tower in downtown Hartford, but I felt no warmth. I was not there to see a housing court clerk. I was there to see Harrison, a criminal defense attorney who cost $600 an hour and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. He did not handle eviction cases, he handled felonies. And that was exactly what I needed, because my family had crossed the line from annoying relatives to active criminals. Harrison sat behind a desk that cost more than my first car, studying the photo I had taken of the fake lease. He did not look shocked. He looked bored. "This is a common play, Jordan," he said, tossing the photo onto the polished mahogany. "They know the loopholes. If you file for eviction today, you might get a hearing in 6 months. By then, your historical moldings will be firewood and your walls will be destroyed. The civil system is designed to keep people housed, not to protect property owners." I sat forward, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I am not here to ask you how to evict them, Harrison. I am here to ask you how to put them in prison. They forged my signature. They broke into my home. There has to be a way to bypass the housing court backlog." Harrison smiled a slow, shark-like grin that did not reach his eyes. "Now you are thinking correctly. See, the mistake most people make is that they try to fight the lie. They scream about the lease being fake. But we are going to do the opposite. We are going to let them have the lie." I frowned, confused. "You want me to let them stay? I want you to let them commit to the lie," Harrison explained, leaning in. "Right now they are just squatters with a piece of paper. That is a misdemeanor at best, usually a civil matter. But if they use that address for anything official, that is where the trap snaps shut. If they receive mail there, if they apply for a credit card, if they use that address to register a business or apply for a loan, that is wire fraud. That is identity theft. That is federal." He pulled a file from his drawer. "Your investigator sent me the preliminary report on your sister-in-law, Nia. She is desperate for cash. Now that she has a prestigious address, she is going to use it. She is going to try to leverage the equity or the appearance of wealth to get money. We need her to do that. We need her to sign a legal document claiming she lives there and has assets she does not have." "So I do nothing," I asked, the realization settling in. "You do worse than nothing," Harrison said. "You disappear. Stop showing up at the house. Stop calling the police. Stop texting them. Let them believe they have beaten you. Let them get comfortable. Criminals get sloppy when they feel safe. We need them to feel like the house is truly theirs. Because the moment they sign a federal loan application using your property as collateral, they are not your tenants anymore. They are targets for the FBI." I stood up, feeling the weight on my chest lift for the first time in days. It was a terrifying plan. I had to watch my house be held hostage and do nothing. But the prize was worth the pain. I did not just want my keys back. I wanted justice. "I understand," I said, shaking Harrison's hand. "I will go dark." "Good," he replied. "Go back to your hotel. Turn off your phone and wait for the alert. Because a woman like Nia cannot resist the urge to grift. It is in her DNA. She will hang herself. We just have to be patient enough to let her tie the noose. The waiting game is the hardest part of any strategy." For 3 days, I sat in that hotel room eating takeout and resisting the urge to drive by my own house. I felt like a ghost haunting the periphery of my own life. But on the fourth morning, the silence broke. My laptop pinged with a priority alert from the private investigator. The subject line was just one word: bingo. I opened the file and there it was: the smoking gun. Nia had not been idle. She had been busy building her empire of sand. The investigator had flagged a new business registration filed with the Secretary of State just 24 hours ago. She had registered a limited liability company called NB Lifestyle Enterprises. That in itself was not illegal, but line 4 of the application was. Under the section titled Principal Place of Business, she had listed my home address, but she did not stop there. The investigator had also intercepted a credit inquiry. Naya had applied for a small business administration loan, a federal loan. She was asking for $150,000 to fund her startup, and she had listed my Victorian estate not just as her office, but as collateral asset she controlled. I called Harrison immediately. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline. She did it, I told him. She used the address to apply for federal funding. Harrison laughed on the other end of the line. It was a cold, dark sound. That is it, Jordan. That is the nail in the coffin. See, lying to a landlord is a civil dispute. Lying to a bank is a crime. But lying to the Small Business Administration on a federal loan application, that is wire fraud and making false statements to a government agency. That carries a mandatory prison sentence. He paused, letting the weight of the situation sink in. She just federalized this case. We do not need to wait for housing court anymore. The FBI investigates loan fraud. And since she forged a lease to prove residency to the bank, she has also committed aggravated identity theft. I looked at the screen at the digital signature Nia had so confidently placed at the bottom of the application. She thought she was being clever. She thought she was securing the bag, as she liked to say. She had no idea she had just signed her own arrest warrant. Harrison continued. I am going to package this evidence: the lease forgery, the business registration, the loan application, and I am going to walk it over to a contact I have at the U.S. Attorney's Office. They love easy wins, and Nia just wrapped herself up in a bow for them. Do not intervene yet. Let the loan process a bit further. Let her think she got the money. We want to catch her when she feels invincible. I hung up the phone and walked to the window. The sky was gray and heavy with rain, but for the first time in a week, I saw the sun breaking through. Nia wanted to be a big-shot businesswoman. She wanted the federal government to invest in her. Well, she was about to get exactly what she wanted. The federal government was about to take a very close interest in her business, and they were going to bring handcuffs, not a check. While Nia was busy aiming for federal prison, my mother decided to try her hand at grand larceny. I was monitoring local buy and sell groups from my laptop when a new listing popped up that made my blood boil. It was a blurry photo taken at a crooked angle captioned simply, "Big Crystal Light. Old but shiny. $500 or best offer. Cash only." I clicked on the image. It was my Baccarat crystal chandelier. I had spent 3 years tracking that specific fixture down at auctions in Paris. It was a 1920 masterpiece worth $22,000. It was the crown jewel of the dining room. And my mother was selling it on Facebook Marketplace for the price of a used television because she wanted quick cash for a spa day. My first instinct was to drive over there and scream. But I stopped myself. Harrison's voice echoed in my head. Let them commit the crime. I picked up the phone and called the private investigator. I need you to send a buyer, I said, my voice steady. Do not negotiate. Pay the full $500. Wear a body camera. And make sure you get a screenshot of her saying the item belongs to her. 2 hours later, I watched the live stream from the buyer's button camera. It was agonizing. My mother had ripped the chandelier out of the ceiling, leaving a gaping hole in the vintage plaster. She had piled the delicate crystal prisms into a cardboard box without any padding. Here it is, Nancy said, wiping dust off her hands. It is real heavy glass. My daughter left it behind when she moved out. She has terrible taste, but some people like this old junk. The buyer, an associate of my PI, played his part perfectly. Are you sure you have the right to sell this? He asked, counting out 5 crisp $100 bills. I do not want any trouble with the owner. Nancy snatched the money greedily, stuffing it into her bra. I am the owner. I told you I live here. Look at the keys. Besides, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? Now take it and go before my son wakes up. He will want a cut if he sees cash. I watched the screen as the buyer carried the box to his van. My mother stood in the doorway counting the money again, a smug smile plastered on her face. She thought she had just made a quick profit. She had no idea she had just committed trafficking in stolen property. In the state of Connecticut, theft of property valued over $20,000 is a Class B felony. By accepting that cash and claiming ownership on video, she had just handed me the power to put her away for up to 20 years. The investigator met me at a storage unit an hour later. We hung the chandelier up safely. It was dirty, and one prism was chipped, but it was intact. We got her, the investigator said, handing me a USB drive. We have the text messages where she negotiates the price. We have the video of the transaction. And we have her confession that she claims ownership. I took the drive and put it in my pocket. My mother had sold my chandelier for $500, but the evidence she gave me in return was priceless. She had just sold her freedom for a handful of cash. Friday night arrived, and with it came the final desecration of my sanctuary. I was sitting in my hotel room reviewing the surveillance photos of the chandelier sale when my phone began to buzz. It was 11:30 at night. The caller ID displayed the name Mrs. Henderson. She was my next-door neighbor and, more importantly, the president of the Homeowners Association. She was a woman who measured grass height with a ruler, and she was currently calling me in a rage. Jordan, she hissed the moment I answered. You need to explain to me why there are 15 cars parked on your lawn. On the grass, Jordan. They are destroying the landscaping. And the noise. My windows are rattling. I closed my eyes, rubbing my temples. I could hear the bass thumping in the background of her call, even through the phone line. Kyle was not just living there. He was hosting a rave. Mrs. Henderson. I am so sorry, I said, keeping my voice calm. As you know, I am currently involved in a dispute with the occupants. I am not on the premises. Well, you better get down here, she snapped. Someone just threw a bottle off your balcony and it shattered on my driveway. There are people smoking God knows what on your front porch. This is a historic neighborhood, not a fraternity house. If you do not shut this down, I am filing a formal complaint against you and calling the police for a noise violation. Please call the police, I said softly. I encourage you to document everything, Mrs. Henderson. In fact, if you can take photos of the cars on the lawn, I would be very grateful. She hung up on me, but 10 minutes later my phone pinged with a video file. I hesitated before clicking play. The video was shaky, taken from Mrs. Henderson's upstairs window, but the image was clear enough to break my heart. My beautiful Victorian home was lit up like a nightclub. Shadows were dancing in the windows. I could see people I did not know walking through my front door holding red plastic cups, but it was what I saw in the living room that made me sick. Through the large bay window, I could see Kyle standing on my dining room table. He was wearing his shoes. He was jumping up and down, pouring what looked like beer into the crowd below. The table was an antique mahogany piece from the 1800s. I could practically feel the wood scratching and warping under his abuse. In the corner of the frame, I saw Nia holding court on my sofa. A cigarette dangled from her hand. She flicked the ash directly onto the floor, onto my hand-woven Persian rug. The urge to drive over there and scream until my throat bled was overwhelming. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to protect my home, to stop the destruction, to save the things I loved. But I stayed seated. I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet. I labeled it Malicious Destruction of Property. Item 1, Landscaping Damage. Estimated repair $5,000. Item 2, Refinishing Antique Mahogany Table. Estimated cost $3,000. Item 3. Professional cleaning and restoration of Persian rug. $2,000. I watched the video again, forcing myself to look at every detail, every stain, every scratch, every act of disrespect. I was not just tallying numbers, I was building a case for criminal mischief. In Connecticut, if the damage exceeds $1,500, it becomes a Class D felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Kyle thought he was having the party of his life. He did not realize that with every stomp of his foot and every flick of his lighter, he was adding years to his sentence. I saved the video to the evidence folder. "Let them party," I whispered to the empty hotel room. "Because the hangover is going to be fatal." The text message from my mother arrived on Sunday afternoon. It was suspiciously polite. "Jordan, please come over for dinner. I made your favorite roast chicken. We need to put this behind us." Any other daughter might have felt relief, but I felt like a soldier being invited into a sniper nest. I knew exactly what this was. It was the final squeeze. They realized they could not bully me into submission, so now they were going to try to manipulate me with guilt and lasagna. I prepared for the dinner like I was preparing for a tactical raid. I put on a soft, oversized sweater to look smaller and less threatening. Underneath it, taped securely to my chest, was a high-fidelity digital recorder. I checked the battery twice. I needed them to feel like they had won. I needed them to get arrogant. When I walked into my house, the smell of garlic and rosemary hit me. It was nauseating. My mother was standing in the kitchen wearing my apron. The table was set with my good china, the Wedgwood plates I was saving for a special occasion. Kyle and Naya were already seated, looking at me with smug expressions. "Sit down, honey," Nancy said, pulling out a chair. "You look tired. This fighting is taking a toll on you." I sat down, keeping my hand over my chest to muffle any sound of the recorder against the fabric. I ate in silence, letting them fill the air with small talk. They talked about the weather. They talked about Nia's baby. They acted as if they had not stolen my home and destroyed my reputation just days ago. Then came the pivot. Nancy wiped her mouth with a napkin and reached under the table. She pulled out a document and slid it across the mahogany surface. "Jordan, we have been thinking," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We do not want to fight you in court. It is expensive and it is ugly. We want a compromise. This is a quitclaim deed. If you sign over 50% of the ownership to Kyle, we will drop all the countersuits. We will live here together as a family. It is the only way to ensure everyone is safe." I looked at the paper. She wanted me to voluntarily give them half of my asset. It was extortion wrapped in a hug. I looked up at her, widening my eyes to feign vulnerability. "But Mom," I said, my voice trembling, "you guys already have the lease. You said the lease allows you to stay here for a year. Why do you need the deed?" Nancy sighed, shaking her head as if I were being difficult. "Jordan, look at me. We need security. A lease is temporary. Kyle needs a permanent foundation." "But the lease," I pressed, leaning in closer to the table. "If the lease is valid, why are you worried? Unless there is something wrong with it." Nancy slammed her hand on the table. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Jordan, stop playing the lawyer. We both know that lease is flimsy. I know Nia forged your signature on it. We all know it was Nia who signed it, not you. But she did it for the family. She did it because we had nowhere else to go. So for the sake of family peace, just look past it. Ignore the signature and sign this deed so we can all move on." My heart hammered against my ribs. There it was. The confession. Clear as day. She had just admitted to knowing about the forgery and confirmed Nia was the one who committed the crime. I looked at Nancy, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. A genuine smile. "I will think about it, Mom," I said, standing up. "I really will." I walked out of the house, clutching my chest. I did not sign the deed. I did not finish the roast chicken. But as I got into my car and pressed stop on the recorder, I knew I had just finished them. That recording was not just leverage. It was the golden key that would unlock their prison cells. The drive to the county sheriff's station felt less like a commute and more like the final march into battle. I could feel the digital recorder pressing against my ribs with every breath I took. It was a small piece of plastic, but it held the weight of my entire future. I did not park in the visitor lot this time. I parked in the spot reserved for official witnesses. When I walked into the precinct, I did not wait at the front desk. I was ushered immediately into a private conference room at the back of the building. The air smelled of stale coffee and serious decisions. Two men were waiting for me. The first was Sheriff Miller, the same officer who had stood on my porch a week ago and told me he could not help me. He looked uncomfortable shifting in his chair and refusing to meet my eyes initially. He knew he had been played by a con artist with a fake lease, and that professional embarrassment was now fueling his desire to make things right. The second man was someone I had not met before. He was wearing a dark gray suit that cost more than my car, and he had the intense, unblinking stare of a predator. He introduced himself as Special Agent Stone from the Federal Banking Fraud Division. He did not smile. He simply pointed to the empty chair across from him. "Do you have it?" Agent Stone asked, his voice low and gravelly. I reached under my sweater and unclipped the recorder. I placed it in the center of the metal table. I did not say a word. I just pressed play. The room went silent as the recording began. My mother's voice filled the small space, clear and undeniable. "We all know it was Nia who signed it, not you. But she did it for the family." I watched the faces of the two men as the confession played out. When Nancy admitted that the lease was forged simply to secure residency, Sheriff Miller's jaw tightened. But when the recording continued and captured the discussion about using the house as collateral for the business loans, Agent Stone leaned forward. "Stop the tape," Stone ordered. I hit the button. The silence that followed was heavy. Stone looked at Miller. "That connects the dots," he said. "The lease was forged to establish residency. The residency was used to apply for the SBA loan. The loan application contained false statements about assets and collateral. That is bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the federal government. And since the mother just admitted to knowing about the forgery and facilitating the occupation of the property, she is an accessory to the conspiracy." Miller nodded, writing furiously on his notepad. "And since they are still occupying the house based on that forged document, every day they stay there is a new count of criminal trespassing and theft of services." Stone opened a thick folder on the table. Inside, I saw the surveillance photos of the chandelier sale, the foreclosure notices on Nia's previous addresses, and the screenshot of Kyle's blackmail text. "We have enough," Stone said, closing the file with a decisive thud. "This is not a civil dispute anymore. This is a criminal enterprise operating out of a stolen residence." He pulled a document from his briefcase and signed it with a flourish. "This is the federal warrant for Nia Brooks. Sheriff, I am authorizing you to execute a raid on the property at dawn. We are taking them into custody." Sheriff Miller looked at me, finally meeting my eyes. His expression was apologetic but grim. "We will need you to be there, Ms. Jordan. We need the owner on site to verify the property damage and to secure the premises once we clear them out. It is going to be loud, and it is going to be ugly. Are you ready for that?" I took the recorder back and slipped it into my pocket. I thought about the scratch on the floor. I thought about the chandelier sold for cash. I thought about the way they looked at me across the dinner table, lying to my face while eating my food. I stood up and smoothed down my sweater. "I have been ready since the day they changed my locks," I said. "I will see you at dawn, gentlemen. Bring the battering ram. I do not think they are going to open the door for us this time." The raid was scheduled and the team was ready, but before the law could descend, I had to witness the carnival. Nia had decided to throw a launch party for her new business venture, a skincare line called Goddess Glow, which was nothing more than repackaged generic lotion sold at a 5,000% markup. She had invited every person she was trying to swindle along with a handful of local social climbers who had no idea they were walking into a crime scene. I watched the feed from a surveillance van parked down the street. The transformation of my home was grotesque. Nia had covered the hand-carved oak paneling of the foyer with cheap gold lame fabric. Balloons in tacky shades of neon pink and metallic silver were taped directly onto the vintage wallpaper. A massive banner hung over the grand staircase reading Nia Brooks' Empire. The elegance of the Victorian architecture was suffocating under layers of plastic and desperation. The guests began to arrive. They were not the sophisticated art collectors or philanthropists who usually frequented the neighborhood. These were Nia's targets. Young women desperate for a side hustle, gullible investors looking for a quick return, and a few hangers-on who just wanted free champagne. They wandered through my living room, touching my sculptures with greasy fingers and marveling at the wealth Nia claimed was hers. In the center of it all was Nia. She was wearing a floor-length gown that sparkled aggressively under the rented studio lights. She held a microphone in one hand and her phone in the other, live streaming to her followers. "Welcome everyone to my humble abode," she announced, her voice amplified by a cheap speaker system that rattled the windows. "I am so glad you could join me to celebrate the launch of Goddess Glow. People ask me all the time, Nia, how did you buy a $2 million mansion at 28? And I tell them it is all about mindset. It is about manifestation. And it is about buying my starter kit for just $500. I watched as she gestured grandly to the room, claiming my hard work as her own. She pointed to the fireplace she had tried to destroy. "I remember when I wrote the check for this place," she lied without blinking. "It was scary, but I knew I deserved luxury. And now you can have it too." Kyle was circulating through the room, playing the role of the supportive, wealthy husband. He was wearing a tuxedo that was clearly ill-fitting and too tight in the shoulders. He was pouring cheap, sparkling wine into plastic flutes, pretending it was Dom Perignon. "This is the life, baby," he shouted to a group of potential investors. "You just gotta grind. We grind hard." It was a masterclass in delusion. They had built a stage on top of a sinkhole. Every word they spoke, every product they pitched, was evidence of wire fraud. They were soliciting money based on a falsified lifestyle. I looked at the agent sitting next to me in the van. He was checking his watch. "Is it time?" he asked. I looked at the screen one last time. Nia was raising a toast, smiling like a queen on a throne of lies. "It is time," I said. "Let us crash the party." Outside the house, the night air was shattered by a sound that no amount of loud bass could hide. It began as a distant wail and quickly swelled into a deafening symphony of sirens. One by one, the heavy SUVs of the federal task force turned into the driveway, their tires crunching over the gravel with authority. I stepped out of the lead vehicle. I was not wearing a party dress. I was wearing a sharp trench coat and boots, suitable for walking through the wreckage of my former life. Behind me, Agent Stone and Sheriff Miller exited their cars, flanked by a dozen uniformed officers and federal agents in tactical vests. The strobe lights from the police cruisers washed over the house, turning the facade into a chaotic light show of red and blue. Inside, I saw the party grind to a halt. The music cut out abruptly, leaving only the sound of the sirens piercing the silence. Shadows moved frantically against the curtains. Agent Stone nodded to his team. "Go," he said calmly. We walked up the front steps, not as guests, but as an invading army. The front door, which had been barred to me for a week, was not locked this time. It was thrown open by a panicked guest trying to flee, but he was immediately blocked by a wall of federal badges. "Federal agents, everyone stay where you are!" Stone shouted, his voice booming through the foyer. I followed him inside. The smell of cheap perfume and stale alcohol was overwhelming. The room was frozen in a tableau of terror. The guests who moments ago were drinking my wine were now backing against the walls, their hands raised instinctively. But my eyes were locked on one person. Nia. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, frozen mid-sentence. She had dropped her microphone, but she was still clutching her phone. The screen was facing out and the ring light was still blindingly bright. She was still live. For the 3,000 people watching Nia's stream, the content had just shifted from a lifestyle tutorial to a true crime documentary. Nia looked down at the sea of uniforms flooding her stolen kingdom. Her eyes darted around, looking for an exit, looking for Kyle, looking for a lie that could save her. But there were no lies left. Then she saw me. I stood at the base of the stairs, flanked by the sheriff and the federal agent. I did not scream. I did not look angry. I looked at her with the cold detachment of an appraiser looking at a forgery. Nia Brooks, Agent Stone, called out, stepping forward and holding up the warrant. You are under federal investigation for wire fraud and identity theft. The color drained from Nia's face so fast she looked like a corpse. On the screen of her phone, I could see the comments section scrolling so fast it was a blur. The hearts and fire emojis had been replaced by question marks and skull emojis. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. She just stood there, trembling in her sequined gown, while the camera captured every second of her downfall. The empire she claimed to have built was collapsing in real time, and the whole world was watching. Sheriff Miller stepped into the center of the foyer, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room like a blade. He did not look like the hesitant officer who had walked away from my porch a week ago. Tonight, he looked like the hand of justice. He unrolled the document in his hand and read from it with a volume that ensured every guest and every person watching on the live stream heard every single word. Kyle Brooks and Nia Brooks, you are under arrest. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Nia let out a small whimper, her hand going to her mouth. But Kyle did not cower. His face turned a deep shade of crimson, a mix of embarrassment and explosive anger. He stepped down from the staircase, placing himself in front of Nia, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt at intimidation. For what, he shouted, spitting slightly as he spoke. For having a party. This is harassment. I will sue this entire department. You cannot arrest people in their own home. Sheriff Miller did not blink. He continued reading the charges, the list scrolling on, like a receipt for a lifetime of bad decisions. You are being charged with 2 counts of aggravated identity theft, 1 count of malicious destruction of property valued over $5,000. And under federal jurisdiction, you are being charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and making false statements to a lending institution. The guests gasped. The words wire fraud sent a ripple of panic through the room. These people were grifters and hustlers, and they knew exactly what those charges meant. It meant federal prison. It meant no bail. Kyle laughed, a frantic, hysterical sound. That is a lie, he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. My sister is behind this. She is jealous. She is trying to frame us. Tell them, Jordan. Tell them you gave us permission to be here. He looked at me, his eyes wide and desperate, pleading with me to save him one last time. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to do what I had always done, which was to cover for him, to pay his debts, to smooth things over, so the family would not be embarrassed. Tell them you signed the lease, Kyle yelled, his voice cracking. Tell them you said we could stay until the baby comes. I remained silent. I did not move a muscle. I simply looked at him with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the champagne in the plastic glasses. Sheriff Miller stepped forward, closing the distance. We have the forensic report on the lease, Kyle. We know the signature was traced. We also have the recording of your mother admitting to the forgery, and we have the IP logs from this house used to submit the fraudulent loan application. There is no misunderstanding here, son. The only thing you have is the right to remain silent. Kyle looked around the room, searching for an ally. He looked at his friends, but they were already backing away, trying to blend into the wallpaper. He looked at his mother, but she was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the kitchen. He looked at Nia, but she was paralyzed by the realization that her life was over. No! Kyle screamed as 2 deputies grabbed his arms. Get off me! You are making a mistake! Jordan, help me! Do not let them do this! I watched as they twisted his arms behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a decade of manipulation finally snapping shut. Kyle Brooks, the golden child who had never heard the word no, was finally hearing the law tell him exactly where he belonged. And for the first time in his life, I was not there to bail him out. I was there to lock him up. You want the truth, Kyle? I said, my voice calm but carrying effortlessly across the silent foyer. You want everyone to know exactly how we got here. You want me to speak. I walked past him, ignoring his outstretched hands, and approached the cheap audio setup Nia had been using for her presentation. The auxiliary cord was dangling from the speaker. I picked it up. The feedback whined sharply, causing a few guests to cover their ears, but I did not flinch. I plugged the cord into my digital recorder. I am not going to speak for myself, I announced to the room, looking directly into the lens of Nia's phone, which was still broadcasting to the world. I am going to let Mom explain. I pressed play. The sound of my mother's voice boomed through the speakers, distorted slightly by the bass but unmistakable in its clarity. It was the conversation from the dinner table recorded just 48 hours ago. Oh, for heaven's sake, Jordan, stop playing the lawyer. We both know that lease is flimsy. I know Nia forged your signature on it. We all know it was Nia who signed it, not you. But she did it for the family. She did it because we had nowhere else to go. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a sound of pure scandal. The guests who had been drinking champagne and considering investing in Nia's business suddenly looked like they wanted to scrub their skin. The phones that had been lowered were raised again. Flashbulbs started going off. They were not recording a launch party anymore. They were recording a confession. The recording continued mercilessly. So for the sake of family peace, just look past it. Ignore the signature and sign this deed so we can all move on. I hit the stop button. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Nia turned her head slowly to look at Kyle. Her expression was a mix of horror and betrayal. Your mother, she whispered, her voice trembling. She told you she would protect me. She told me she would say she witnessed the signing. She just admitted I did it. She threw me to the wolves. Kyle stammered, his face pale. She did not know she was being recorded, Nia. It is a trap. Jordan trapped us. It is not a trap, I said, stepping back from the speakers. It is evidence. You invited these people here to invest in a business built on credibility. You claimed you owned this estate. You claimed you were self-made. But as you just heard, you are nothing but squatters who forged a signature to steal a home you could never afford. The crowd began to murmur. I heard snippets of conversation that were more damaging than any lawsuit. Is this true? One woman asked loudly. I just wrote her a check for $500. This is insane, another man said, backing toward the door. I am not getting involved in a fraud case. Let us go. The illusion of the wealthy, successful Brooks family shattered instantly. The gold lame fabric looked cheap, the balloons looked sad, and Nia looked like exactly what she was, a fraud. The guests began to scatter, pushing past the police officers to escape the blast radius of the scandal. But the camera was still rolling, and the internet never forgets. The handcuffs were heavy, but the true weight of the situation crushed Nia only when Agent Stone turned his attention away from her and pointed toward the door. Through the open entrance, the flashing lights illuminated a tow truck backing into the driveway. The hook was already being lowered toward the silver Mercedes. That is my car, Nia shrieked, struggling against the deputy who held her. You cannot take my car. I have rights. It is not your car, Agent Stone replied coldly, checking a clipboard. It is a lease obtained through a shell company using a stolen identity. It is evidence. Tow it. He then turned to the table where Nia had displayed her collection of designer handbags, the props she used to convince the world she was a millionaire. He picked up a quilted Chanel bag by the strap. He did not treat it like a luxury item. He treated it like contraband. Bag and tag everything. Stone ordered his team. Every bag, every watch, the studio lights, the laptops. If it was purchased after the loan date or used to facilitate the fraud, it is property of the federal government. No, Nia screamed a sound so piercing it cracked. That is my inventory. You are ruining me. The live stream was still running. The phone had been propped up on a side table during the chaos, and it was capturing the entire repo operation in high definition. The comments were flying by faster than the eye could read, but the emojis were no longer hearts. They were laughing faces and prison bars. Nia realized in that moment that she was not just going to jail, she was becoming a global joke. The humiliation snapped something inside her. She stopped struggling against the officer and whipped her head around to look at Kyle. The loving wife mask disintegrated, instantly replaced by the face of a cornered rat. "This is your fault," she screamed, spitting the words at her husband. "You told me it was safe. You told me your sister would never actually call the police. You said she was soft." Kyle looked at her incredulous. "Me? You are the one who wanted the mansion, Nia. You are the one who needed an address to impress your followers. I told you we should have just rented an apartment, but no, you had to have the Victorian estate. You liar," Nia yelled, lunging at him only to be jerked back by the handcuffs. "You forged the signature. You told me to practice Jordan's handwriting. Officer, he made me do it. I was scared of him. He forced me to sign those papers. I am a victim here." Kyle's face turned purple. "You parasitic witch! You spent the entire loan in 3 days. You bought fake followers. You bought clothes. Do not try to pin this on me." I stood by the fireplace watching them tear each other apart. The perfect couple, the power team, the family that was supposed to be stronger than me, was now cannibalizing itself. They were screaming accusations revealing crimes we had not even looked for yet. They were doing the prosecutor's job for him. Agent Stone looked at me and shook his head slightly. "There is no honor among thieves," he muttered. "Get them out of here," the sheriff ordered. As the deputies dragged them toward the door, still screaming and blaming each other, I walked over to the phone. Nia's face was still visible on the screen, crying, mascara running down her cheeks. I looked at the number of viewers. 15,000 people were watching the finale of the Brooks family reality show. I reached out and pressed the button. The screen went black. The show was canceled. The sirens were fading into the distance, carrying my brother and his wife to a federal holding cell, but the main villain was still in the room. The guests had fled, leaving the front door wide open, and the cold night air was swirling through the foyer, popping the cheap balloons Nia had taped to the walls. I turned to leave, intending to let the police wrap up the scene, but a screech echoed from the kitchen. "You ungrateful wretch!" My mother Nancy charged at me. She moved with a speed I had not seen in years, fueled by pure hysterical rage. Her face was twisted into a mask of hatred, her makeup smeared from the earlier tears. She did not look like a mother looking at her child. She looked like a predator whose meal had just been snatched away. She raised her hand to strike me, aiming for my face. It was a reflex she had used 1,000 times in my childhood to keep me in line. But I was not a child anymore. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply caught her wrist in mid-air. My grip was iron tight. I held her hand inches from my cheek, looking her dead in the eye. "Do not ever touch me again," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Nancy struggled to pull her arm back, panting heavily. "You monster! You set them up! You sent your own brother to prison! How could you be so cold? This house is ours! You think you are so special with your high and mighty job, but we know the truth. You built this life on your father's money. This is his legacy. You stole his fortune and left us with nothing." She screamed the words, spitting them at me. It was the lie she had told herself for 20 years. The mythology of the Brooks family was that my father was a genius businessman who had been cheated, and that I had somehow siphoned off the wealth that belonged to Kyle. I released her wrist, pushing her back slightly. She stumbled against the table where Nia's fake designer bags were being tagged by an agent. "You really believe that, do you?" I asked calmly. "You really believe Dad left behind a fortune?" I reached into my trench coat and pulled out the final piece of ammunition I had brought with me. It was not a digital recorder or a USB drive. It was a physical folder, old and weathered with yellowing edges. The label on the front was typed on a typewriter, not a computer. I threw it onto the table in front of her. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding over the gold lame tablecloth. "Read it," I commanded. Nancy looked at the folder. Her hands were shaking as she opened it. "This is the forensic accounting of Dad's estate from the year he died," I said, my voice cutting through the room. "Look at the last page, Nancy. Look at the final balance." She stared at the paper, her eyes scanning the columns of red ink. My father did not leave me millions, I continued mercilessly. He died with $412 in his checking account and $3 million in gambling debts. He mortgaged this family into oblivion. He stole from my college fund. He stole from Grandma's pension. Nancy went pale. She dropped the paper as if it burned her fingers. No, she whispered. That is not true. He told me he had offshore accounts. He lied, I said, stepping closer. Just like Nia lied. Just like you lie. There was no money, Nancy. The reason we did not lose the family home 15 years ago is because I paid the arrears. The reason Kyle went to private school is because I paid the tuition. Everything you have eaten, every stitch of clothing you have worn for a decade came from my work, not his. Mine. I pointed at the house around us. This house was not bought with Dad's money. It was bought with the money I made cleaning up his messes. I am not the thief, Nancy. I am the only reason you are not living in a shelter, and you just tried to destroy the only safety net you had left. Nancy slumped against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. The delusion she had lived in for decades, the idea that she was a wealthy matriarch wronged by a greedy daughter, had just been obliterated by a single sheet of paper. She looked up at me, but the fire was gone. All that was left was a terrified old woman, realizing she had bitten the hand that fed her, and now that hand was closed into a fist. Nancy sat amidst the ruins of the party, looking at the financial records that proved her husband was a failure. She looked like she had been punched in the gut, but I was not done. I had one more ghost to summon. A ghost she feared more than poverty. You always wondered how I afforded the down payment. I said, my voice soft but echoing in the empty hall. You thought I was hiding Dad's money, but you were looking at the wrong side of the family tree. I turned the page of the folder to a document with a blue legal seal. This house was bought with the proceeds from the blind trust established by Grandmother Eleanor. Nancy flinched, physically recoiling at the name. She hated my father's mother with a passion that burned brighter than the sun. Eleanor was the one woman Nancy could never manipulate, the one woman who saw right through her gold-digging facade. That old witch, Nancy hissed, venom returning to her voice. She never gave us a dime. She hated me. She did hate you, I agreed. But she loved me. And she was smart. She knew that one day, after Dad was gone, you would come for whatever was left. She knew you would try to strip me bare to feed your own vanity. So she added a clause. A poison pill, just for you. I pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. Read it, Mom. It says that the funds are designated solely for the purchase of a primary residence for Jordan Brooks. But here is the kicker. It says that if Nancy Brooks or any of her other descendants attempt to occupy, seize, or litigate against this property, they trigger the forfeiture clause. Nancy looked up, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. What does that mean? It means, I explained, leaning down so our faces were level, that by moving into this house, by forging a lease and claiming ownership, you and Kyle didn't just break the law. You violated the terms of Grandma's will, and the penalty is automatic. I tapped the paper. The penalty is total disinheritance from the family residual fund. That monthly stipend you live on. Gone. The small beach cottage in Florida you rent out for income. Gone. The medical insurance paid by the estate. Gone. Nancy froze. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The residual fund was her lifeline. It was the only reason she could afford her lifestyle. She had risked it all to steal my house, and in doing so, she had cut her own throat. Grandma Eleanor predicted this, I said, standing up and towering over her. She wrote this from the grave, Nancy. She knew your greed would be your undoing. She set a trap that took 10 years to spring, and you walked right into it. You wanted my house. Now you do not even have your own. Nancy made a sound that was half sob, half scream. She clawed at the floor tiles as if the ground were dissolving beneath her. She had lost her son to prison. She had lost her social standing to scandal. And now she had lost her financial survival to the mother-in-law she had mocked for decades. I closed the folder and tucked it back into my coat. The war was over. I looked at the sheriff who was standing by the door waiting for my signal. "Get her off my property, Sheriff," I said, turning my back on her. "And make sure she takes her trash with her. I have a lot of cleaning to do." The sound of steel ratcheting shut was the period at the end of a very long sentence. I watched as the deputies marched my brother and his wife toward the open door. Kyle was still mumbling incoherently about suing the department, but the fight had left his eyes. He looked small. Without my protection, without my money to fix his mistakes, he was just a man in a cheap tuxedo facing federal charges. Nia was worse. The makeup had streaked down her face, leaving black tear tracks that looked like war paint gone wrong. She did not look at me as she passed. She stared at the floor, her wrists bound behind her back, her fake empire dissolving into the reality of a holding cell. As they crossed the threshold into the flashing red lights of the police cruisers, the silence they left behind was deafening. Nancy stood alone in the center of the foyer. She looked at the empty doorway, then at Agent Stone, expecting to be handcuffed next. "You are not under arrest, ma'am," Agent Stone said, holstering his weapon. "Not tonight. But this property is now a federal crime scene, and you are no longer a resident. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate the premises." Nancy blinked, trying to process the mercy that felt like a punishment. She looked around frantically. She lunged toward this coat rack, grabbing her fur coat and a handful of silver picture frames from the entry table. "Put it down," I said. My voice was not loud, but it stopped her dead in her tracks. "That coat was bought with the credit card Kyle opened in my name," I said, stepping forward. "Those frames are antique silver belonging to the estate. You own nothing, Nancy. You leave with the clothes on your back. That is it." She looked at the sheriff, appealing for help, but he just crossed his arms and pointed to the door. She dropped the coat. She dropped the frames. With a final hateful glare, she turned and walked out into the cold night air. She had no car since I had stopped paying the lease. She had no money since the trust fund was frozen. She walked down the driveway past the police cars and disappeared into the darkness, completely and utterly alone. I walked over to the tripod where Nia's phone was still broadcasting. The battery was low, but the screen was bright. I looked at the chat. The tide had turned violently. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur, but the sentiment was clear. The people who had called me a monster an hour ago were now flooding the chat with apologies. Team Jordan, one comment read, "I cannot believe I supported these grifters." Another wrote, "Queen of receipts," someone else typed, followed by a crown emoji. They saw the truth. They saw the receipts. They saw the foreclosure of a lie. I did not say anything to them. I did not gloat. I simply reached out and tapped the red button. End stream. The screen went black. The house was quiet. The party was over. I looked around at the wreckage, the deflated balloons, the spilled wine, the cheap decorations covering my beautiful wood paneling. It was a mess, but it was my mess. And for the first time in my life, I was free to clean it up without anyone standing in my way. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of victory. It smelled like bleach and silence. 3 months is a long time in the real world, but in the legal system, it usually passes in the blink of an eye. However, thanks to the mountain of evidence I had provided, the federal prosecutors did not need much time to build their case. They had the text messages, the bank records, the video of the chandelier sale, and the live stream of the arrest. It was an open and shut case. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse in New Haven, watching the final act of the tragedy play out. The room was sterile and silent, stripped of all the drama and noise that had consumed my life for the past year. Nia stood before the judge. The sequined gown was gone, replaced by a drab gray prison uniform that washed out her complexion. Her roots were showing, and without her ring light and filters, she looked young and terrified. She was not an heiress. She was just a girl from Florida who had tried to fake it until she made it and had failed spectacularly. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at her with zero sympathy. "Nia Brooks, you have been found guilty of 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity theft." You used the credit and reputation of others to fund a lifestyle you could not afford. This court sentences you to 24 months in a federal correctional facility, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The gavel banged. It was a sharp final sound. Nia buckled at the knees, sobbing loudly as the marshals moved in to handcuff her. She looked back at the gallery, searching for Kyle, but he refused to look at her. Kyle stood up next. His lawyer had managed to cut a plea deal, arguing that he was manipulated by his wife. It was pathetic but effective. He received 5 years of probation and 400 hours of community service. He was free, but he was a convicted felon. He would never work in finance. He would never get a loan. He was tethered to the state, his passport revoked. He walked past me on his way out, his eyes full of resentment, but he did not say a word. He knew I had the rest of the recordings. But the worst punishment was reserved for the one person not in the courtroom. I drove past the address where my mother now lived. It was not a Victorian estate. It was a basement studio in a crumbling building on the wrong side of town. The blinds were drawn crookedly. Nancy sat inside on a sagging mattress she had picked up from a thrift store. The air smelled of damp drywall and other people's cooking. She held her phone in her hand, staring at it, waiting for it to ring. But it was silent. The same aunts and uncles, the flying monkeys who had bombarded me with calls demanding I share my wealth, had now abandoned her. The moment the scandal broke, the moment the money dried up, and the shame set in, they vanished. Nobody wanted to be associated with the woman who tried to defraud her own daughter. She was radioactive. She had lost her home. She had lost her social standing. She had lost her family. She sat in the dim light of a single bulb, heating a can of soup on a hot plate, surrounded by the silence she had created. Justice had not just been served. It had been delivered cold. The silence that settled over the house after the raid was different. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a hostage situation. It was the clean, crisp silence of a blank canvas. But before I could truly rest, I had to perform an exorcism. I did not use sage or holy water. I used a construction crew and a massive industrial dumpster. The trucks arrived at 8 in the morning. I stood on the front lawn with a clipboard, directing the operation like a general in peacetime. The mission was simple. If Nia or Kyle had touched it, I wanted it gone. The first casualty was the gold lame fabric stapled to the foyer walls. I watched with grim satisfaction as the workers ripped it down in long, shimmering strips. The sound of the staples popping free from the wood sounded like applause. Underneath the 100-year-old oak paneling was scarred with small holes, but it was still standing. It was dignified. We moved to the living room. The neon paint Nia had used for her accent wall was covered with a primer so thick it smelled like victory. The cheap polyester carpeting in the guest wing, which had absorbed the smell of stale perfume and entitlement, was torn up. As the workers rolled it away, revealing the original heart pine floorboards beneath, I felt my chest expand. The house could finally breathe again. I spared no expense. I hired a master mason to repair the brickwork in the fireplace, where Kyle had drilled holes to mount his television. I hired a specialist to refinish the mahogany dining table, removing the scratches from Kyle's shoes. The restoration was surgical. I was erasing them from history. The most important moment came at the end of the week. The baccarat chandelier, which I had rescued from my mother's illegal sale, was sitting in a crate in the hallway. It had been cleaned and restrung, every crystal prism polished to perfection. I watched as the electricians hoisted it back into place. When they flipped the switch, the light did not just turn on, it exploded. Thousands of tiny rainbows fractured across the freshly painted walls, dancing over the restored wood. The room didn't look like a nightclub anymore. It looked like a home. I walked through the rooms, running my hand along the surfaces. The sticky residue of the balloons was gone. The cheap furniture was in a landfill. The energy of desperation and greed had been scrubbed away. That evening I sat in my favorite armchair by the window. There was no noise from the neighbors, no bass thumping from a party, no screaming matches in the kitchen. Just the ticking of the grandfather clock and the wind in the trees. I had spent a fortune to buy this house and a fortune to save it. But looking at the way the moonlight hit the floorboards, I knew it was worth every penny. I had stripped away the fake gold to reveal the real treasure underneath. My peace. The scandal that was supposed to bury my career turned out to be the most effective marketing campaign I could have ever dreamed of. In the high-stakes world of fine art, appraisal trust is the only currency that matters. Collectors are paranoid. They are terrified of buying forgeries, of being swindled, of looking foolish. When the news broke that I had ruthlessly exposed my own family for fraud, that I had sent my sister-in-law to prison rather than let her pass off a fake life as real, something shifted. I was no longer just an appraiser. I was the Iron Lady of authenticity. My phone at the auction house did not stop ringing. The same clients who had canceled their appointments 3 months ago were now begging to get back on my calendar. The logic was twisted but undeniable. If Jordan Brooks would not lie to save her own brother, she certainly would not lie to sell a painting. My refusal to compromise became my brand signature. The senior partner who had suspended me welcomed me back, not with an apology, but with a corner office and a 20% raise. He told me that 3 museums had specifically requested me to audit their collections because they wanted the woman who had zero tolerance for fakes. To celebrate my reinstatement and the restoration of my home, I decided to host a gala. But this was not a party for clout. It was a charity exhibition to benefit the Historical Preservation Society. The night of the event, the driveway was once again filled with vehicles, but this time there were no flashing police lights. There were lines of black town cars and vintage Rolls-Royces depositing the true elite of Connecticut society onto my doorstep. I stood in the foyer wearing a black velvet gown that was simple, elegant, and completely mine. The house shined. The gold lame was gone, replaced by the warm glow of the baccarat chandelier. The air did not smell of cheap perfume and desperation. It smelled of fresh lilies and expensive champagne. I watched the guests circulate through the rooms. These were people who knew the difference between a costume and a uniform. They admired the plasterwork I had restored. They complimented the original oil paintings I had brought out of storage. Mrs. Davenport, the client who had started the boycott against me, approached me near the fireplace. She held a glass of vintage bubbly and looked at the restored mantelpiece. "Jordan," she said, her voice dripping with a new kind of respect, "I heard what you did. It takes a very strong backbone to cut out the rot. I apologize for doubting your character. You are clearly a woman of impeccable standards." I clinked my glass against hers. "Quality is non-negotiable, Mrs. Davenport," I replied with a smile. "In art and in life." I looked around the room. Nia had tried to fill this space with noise and lies, hoping to trick people into loving her. I had filled it with history and truth. The house was finally doing what it was designed to do. It was breathing. It was hosting. It was alive. As the string quartet began to play in the corner, I realized that the smear campaign had failed in the most magnificent way possible. They tried to paint me as a villain. Instead, they had framed me as a hero. I took a sip of champagne and let the music wash over me. The nightmare was over. The gallery was open, and business was booming. The last guest had departed an hour ago, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and the satisfaction of a night perfectly executed. I kicked off my heels and curled my legs up onto the velvet armchair, positioned directly in front of the roaring fire. In my hand was a glass of vintage Bordeaux, a deep ruby red that caught the light of the flames. The house was settling around me, the old wood creaking softly in the wind, not groaning in pain, but sighing in relief. For the first time in months, the air felt light. There was no tension, no waiting for the next scream, no listening for the sound of a key turning in the lock that shouldn't be there. Then the silence was broken. My phone, which I had placed on the side table, lit up. The vibration buzzed against the wood, a harsh intrusion into my sanctuary. I picked it up and looked at the screen. Incoming call, Mom. I stared at the name. I could picture her perfectly. She was likely sitting in that damp studio apartment, shivering in the draft, staring at the phone with the same desperation she had used to manipulate me for 30 years. She was calling to beg, or maybe to scream, or perhaps to try one last gaslighting attempt to tell me that I was the villain and she was the victim. A month ago, seeing that name would have made my heart race. It would have triggered a wave of guilt and obligation. I would have answered thinking I could fix it, thinking that if I just explained myself well enough, she would finally love me. But tonight, my pulse did not quicken. My hand did not shake. I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the rich oak flavor settle on my tongue. I looked at the screen not with anger, but with the detached pity one feels for a stranger who has lost their way. She was a ghost trying to haunt a house that had been exorcised. I didn't decline the call. That would imply I was available to be called again. Instead, I tapped the small information icon. I scrolled down to the bottom of the contact menu. My thumb hovered over the red text. Block this caller. I pressed it. The screen went dark. The buzzing stopped. The connection was severed not just digitally, but spiritually. She was gone. I placed the phone face down on the table and looked back at the fire. The flames danced in the reflection of the glass doors. People think a house is just an investment. They think it is just bricks and mortar, a collection of wood and glass. They are wrong. This place is not just a building. It is a fortress. It is the physical manifestation of the boundaries I finally had the courage to build. Every brick in the wall is a no, I finally said. Every locked door is a refusal to be used. I fought a war for these four walls. I survived the guilt, the shame, the public humiliation, and the betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect me. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit driveway. It was empty. It was quiet. It was mine. I raised my glass to the reflection of the woman in the window. The daughter who served is dead. The woman who owns herself has finally moved in. This house is a fortress of freedom. And the key. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key, feeling the cold metal against my warm skin. The key belongs to only one person. The most profound lesson from Jordan's story is that boundaries are not an act of cruelty. They are an act of survival. For years, Jordan confused love with enabling. She believed that being a good daughter and sister meant shielding her family from the consequences of their own incompetence and greed. She paid the debts, she silenced her own needs, and she swallowed the disrespect under the guise of family duty. However, this story illustrates a brutal truth. When you feed a parasite, it does not become grateful, it becomes hungry. By constantly saving Kyle and Nancy, Jordan robbed them of the opportunity to mature, eventually turning them into criminals who felt entitled to her hard work. The story teaches us that DNA is not a suicide pact. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm, especially when those people are the ones holding the matches. Jordan's true victory was not winning the court case or restoring the house. Her victory was realizing that her peace was more valuable than their approval. She learned that you cannot save people who are determined to drown, especially if they are trying to use you as a life raft. True ownership is not just about holding the deed to a house. It is about owning your right to say no without guilt. If this story resonated with you, and you have ever had to choose between your mental peace and your family's expectations, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments below, what is the hardest boundary you have ever had to set with a toxic family member? I want to hear your story.